The story of the Ottoman Empire begins in the rugged lands of Anatolia in the late 13th century. This was a time of uncertainty, chaos, and shifting powers. The Seljuk Sultanate, once the dominant Turkish force in the region, had weakened under the crushing weight of Mongol invasions. Out of its fragments rose countless small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks, each competing for survival along the dangerous frontier with the Byzantine Empire. Most of these beyliks would rise and fall, leaving little trace in history. But one among them, led by a man named Osman, would change the destiny of the world. Osman was the son of Ertuğrul, a respected leader of the Kaya tribe, one of the many Turkic groups who had migrated into Anatolia. Unlike mighty kings or emperors, Osman began his rule with modest resources. He commanded a small band of warriors, bound by loyalty and faith. But Osman possessed something that many lacked: vision. He embraced the title of Ghazi, a warrior of the frontier, fighting for both faith and territory. For Osman and his followers, battle was not only about land, but about spreading the influence of Islam into lands still under Byzantine control. In the year 1301, Osman won a decisive battle near the town of Beyliği against Byzantine forces. Though small in scale compared to later wars, this victory carried great symbolic weight. It marked the Ottomans as a rising force, one that could not be ignored. Slowly, more warriors and tribes were drawn to Osman's banner. His principality began to grow, stretching across fertile valleys and strategically important towns. From these humble beginnings, the foundation of the Ottoman state was laid. When Osman died in the early 1320s, leadership passed to his son Orhan. Under Orhan, the Ottomans underwent a transformation. No longer a mere band of frontier raiders, they became an organized state. Orhan introduced systems of governance, taxation, and law, ensuring that conquered lands were not only held, but also prospered. The greatest achievement of his reign came in 1326, with the capture of Bursa. This Byzantine city became the first true capital of the Ottomans. Bursa was more than a military prize. It was a symbol of permanence. With it came wealth from trade, stability for administration, and a base for further expansion. Orhan also introduced crucial military reforms. He began the practice of paying soldiers regular salaries, creating a standing army that was loyal not just to plunder, but to the state itself. Among his troops were Christian mercenaries, who would eventually evolve into the formidable Janissary Corps. This innovation gave the Ottomans a professional edge over many of their rivals, who still relied on feudal levies and irregular forces. With time, their reputation as disciplined and relentless warriors spread across Anatolia and the Balkans. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had begun to cross into Europe. Taking advantage of Byzantine weakness and political turmoil, they established a foothold in Gallipoli in 1354, after a devastating earthquake left the city vulnerable. From there, the Ottoman tide pushed deeper into the Balkans, clashing with Serbs, Bulgarians, and Hungarians. What had once been a small frontier principality now stood as a growing power straddling two continents. Yet it was under Orhan's successor, Murad I, that the Ottoman state would truly begin to emerge as a dominant empire. Murad expanded the empire's borders both east and west, capturing Thrace and moving the capital to Edirne, closer to the European front. His reign marked the beginning of Ottoman supremacy in the Balkans, culminating in the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Though Murad lost his life on that battlefield, the Ottomans stood victorious, securing their presence in southeastern Europe for centuries to come. The foundations had been set. Osman had dreamed, Orhan had built, and Murad had expanded. A new empire was rising, and the world was beginning to notice. What lay ahead would be centuries of conquest, culture, and power as the Ottomans prepared to challenge even the mightiest of empires. After the death of Murad III at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Ottoman throne passed to his son Bayezid, known to history as Bayezid, the Thunderbolt. His nickname reflected both his speed in battle and his fiery temperament. Bayezid inherited not just the growing Ottoman realm, but also the ambition to push it further. He wasted no time in consolidating power, stamping out rivals, and extending the empire's reach across Anatolia and the Balkans. Bayezid was a relentless warrior. He campaigned with extraordinary energy, defeating Serbian, Bulgarian, and Wallachian forces. Within a few short years, he had expanded Ottoman authority deeper into southeastern Europe. The Christian kingdoms of the Balkans watched with dread as fortress after fortress fell to the Turks. To resist him, a crusade was organized under the leadership of King Sigismund of Hungary. This culminated in the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, one of the most famous clashes between Ottoman and European forces of the late Middle Ages. The crusading army, composed of knights from Hungary, France, and other European states, was confident of victory. But Bayezid, leading his disciplined army, crushed them with devastating force. The result shocked Europe. The Ottoman Empire was no longer seen as a minor frontier power. It was a formidable empire, capable of standing against the united armies of Christendom. From that moment, fear of the Ottomans spread across Europe. Yet Bayezid's ambitions reached beyond Europe. He sought to unify Anatolia under his control, subduing rival Turkish beyliks and bringing their territories into the Ottoman fold. This policy was successful for a time, but it also brought him into conflict with an even greater power on the horizon, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur had carved out an empire stretching from Central Asia to Persia, and he viewed Bayezid's growing strength as a challenge to his own dominance. The confrontation between Bayezid and Timur reached its climax at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. The battle was catastrophic for the Ottomans. Timur's forces outnumbered Bayezid's, and several of Bayezid's allies defected in the heat of combat. The Ottoman army was crushed, and Bayezid himself was captured. According to some accounts, Timur kept Bayezid in an iron cage, a humiliation that later chroniclers embellished to symbolize the fall of the proud sultan. Within a year, Bayezid was dead, and the empire he had expanded so rapidly now seemed on the brink of collapse. The aftermath of Ankara plunged the Ottoman state into chaos. This period is known as the Interregnum, a decade-long civil war between Bayezid's sons. Each son claimed the right to the throne, and the empire was torn apart by their rivalries. For 11 long years, the once mighty Ottomans teetered on the edge of destruction. Rivals inside and outside the empire saw their chance. Christian states in the Balkans regained lost lands, while rival Turkish beyliks reasserted independence in Anatolia. But from this chaos emerged Mehmed I, one of Bayezid's sons. Through patience, diplomacy, and calculated military campaigns, Mehmed slowly defeated his brothers and reunified the empire. By 1413, he had restored stability, earning the title the Restorer. Though his reign was not marked by grand conquests, it was crucial in saving the Ottoman state from disintegration. Without Mehmed's steady leadership, the empire might have vanished from history, remembered only as one of many Turkish principalities that rose and fell in Anatolia. After Mehmed's death, the throne passed to his son, Murad II. Murad inherited an empire that was stable, but surrounded by enemies eager to test its strength. He fought repeated wars against the Hungarians, Venetians, and other European powers, as well as against rebellious Anatolian lords. His reign was marked by constant campaigns, often exhausting but necessary to preserve Ottoman survival. The defining moment of Murad's rule came in 1444 at the Battle of Varna. A coalition of European forces, spurred by papal calls for a crusade, marched against the Ottomans. The young King Władysław of Poland and Hungary led the crusaders, determined to drive the Turks out of Europe. Murad, though briefly retired, returned to command his army. At Varna, he secured a decisive Ottoman victory. King Władysław was killed in battle, and the Crusader dream of expelling the Ottomans from Europe collapsed. Murad's reign solidified Ottoman strength in both Anatolia and the Balkans, paving the way for one of the greatest rulers in history, his son, Mehmed II. In 1451, upon Murad's death, Mehmed ascended the throne. He was young, ambitious, and brilliant. And he carried a vision that would shake the world, the conquest of Constantinople. For over a millennium, Constantinople had stood as one of the most impregnable cities in the world. The capital of the Byzantine Empire, it had endured countless sieges, repelling Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Rus. To medieval Europe, it was the bulwark of Christendom in the East. To the Ottomans, it was the ultimate prize, the key to empire. Many had tried and failed, but Mehmed was determined to succeed. With the stage set, the world watched as the young sultan prepared to achieve what had seemed impossible for centuries. The fall of Constantinople would not only redefine the destiny of the Ottomans, but alter the course of global history itself. In 1451, when the young Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne, few could have imagined the scale of his ambition. Only 19 years old, he faced skepticism from many within and beyond his empire. Yet beneath his youth lay determination, intelligence, and an unshakable will to achieve greatness. His dream was bold, one that had eluded countless leaders for centuries: the capture of Constantinople. Constantinople, the legendary city of the Byzantine Empire, stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its walls, massive and impenetrable, had repelled attackers for 1,000 years. Emperors, caliphs, and kings had all tried and failed. But Mehmed was no ordinary ruler. He recognized that to secure the Ottomans as a true empire, he needed Constantinople not only as a symbol, but as a capital. Without it, the empire would remain incomplete. With it, the Ottomans would stand unrivaled. Mehmed began by preparing meticulously. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the Bosporus, known as Rumeli Hisarı, directly opposite an earlier Ottoman fortress. This gave him control of the straits, cutting off Constantinople from aid by sea. He gathered a vast army, numbering perhaps over 100,000 men, and assembled a fleet to blockade the city from the water. Most crucially, he employed new technology, giant cannons designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban. These massive weapons could hurl enormous stone balls, capable of cracking even the strongest walls of the city. In the spring of 1453, the siege began. For weeks, the city's defenders, numbering barely 7,000, fought with desperate courage. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XV led his men with honor, knowing that Constantinople's fall would mean the end of an empire that had lasted over a millennium. The cannons roared day after day, shaking the ancient walls. Mehmed's men launched repeated assaults, each one testing the city's defenses. Despite overwhelming odds, the Byzantines held firm. The sea walls protected them from naval attacks, and the great chain across the Golden Horn blocked Ottoman ships from entering the harbor. For a time, it seemed as if Constantinople might once again survive. But Mehmed refused to relent. In a daring move, he ordered his men to haul ships overland, across greased logs, bypassing the chain and placing his fleet inside the Golden Horn. The defenders were stunned. The city, already surrounded on land, was now threatened by sea as well. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final assault. Waves of Ottoman soldiers stormed the battered walls. Janissaries, the elite corps of the empire, pressed forward with relentless discipline. The defenders fought with everything they had, but exhaustion and numbers overwhelmed them. Emperor Constantine XV, refusing to flee, fought and fell with his men. By dawn, the banners of the Ottomans flew over Constantinople. The city had fallen. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, was no more. Mehmed entered the city as a conqueror, but also as a visionary. He declared himself the new ruler of a capital that he renamed Istanbul. Far from destroying it, he sought to revive the city, turning it into the beating heart of his empire. He ordered the repair of its walls, the restoration of trade, and the conversion of Hagia Sophia, the great church of Byzantium, into a mosque. In doing so, he symbolized both conquest and continuity. The fall of Constantinople was a turning point in world history. It ended the Byzantine Empire, which had stood for more than 1,000 years. It marked the ascendance of the Ottomans as a true world power. For Europe, it was a shock, a reminder that the East was rising. For the Ottomans, it was the dawn of a new era. Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, continued his campaigns with unrelenting energy. He expanded into the Balkans, defeating Hungary and Serbia, and subjugated much of Greece. His fleets sailed across the Mediterranean, challenging the Venetians and Genoese. He pushed into Anatolia, crushing rival Turkish principalities. Even in his youth, he understood that the empire must be more than military power alone. He established laws, strengthened administration, and welcomed scholars, architects, and artists to his court. Istanbul flourished as a center of culture and learning. Yet the conquest of Constantinople remained his greatest achievement, the victory that defined his reign and secured his place in history. It was the moment when the Ottomans ceased to be merely a regional power and became an empire destined to shape the destiny of continents. By the time Mehmed died in 1481, he had transformed the empire. He had proven himself not only as a conqueror, but as a builder. His successors would inherit a state strong, centralized, and ambitious. The foundation for future greatness was laid, but the story of the Ottomans was only beginning. Ahead lay even greater heights, and with them, challenges that would test the endurance of empire. When Mehmed the Conqueror died in 1481, the empire he left behind was strong but restless. His son Bayezid II ascended the throne, inheriting the challenge of preserving what had been so quickly built. Unlike his father, Bayezid was less a conqueror and more a consolidator. His reign was marked not by dramatic wars of conquest, but by the careful work of stabilizing and administering an empire that now spanned 2 continents. Bayezid strengthened the financial system, ensured the flow of trade through Istanbul, and promoted scholarship and art. Under his rule, the empire prospered, but he faced internal disputes that tested his authority. His most pressing challenge came from within his own family. Bayezid's son, Selim, was a man of extraordinary ambition and ruthless determination. In time, Selim would rise against his father, forcing Bayezid to abdicate in 1512. The peaceful consolidator gave way to one of the most aggressive and transformative sultans in Ottoman history. Selim I, known as Selim the Grim. Selim was a very different ruler from his father. Fierce, decisive, and uncompromising, he reshaped the empire with a vision that reached far beyond the Balkans and Anatolia. His eyes turned to the heartlands of the Islamic world, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. His first challenge came from the Safavid Empire in Persia, whose ruler, Shah Ismail, had embraced Shia Islam and promoted it vigorously. The Ottomans, as Sunni Muslims, saw the Safavids as both a political and religious threat. In 1514, Selim marched east with a massive army, meeting the Safavids at the Battle of Edirne. The battle was decisive. Selim's forces, equipped with superior firearms and artillery, crushed the Safavid cavalry. The victory ensured Ottoman dominance in eastern Anatolia and checked Safavid expansion. It also marked a turning point in the use of gunpowder weapons in Middle Eastern warfare. Selim had proven himself not just as a warrior, but as a master of modern military tactics. But his ambitions did not stop there. Selim next turned south toward the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, one of the oldest and most respected Islamic powers. The Mamluks controlled not only Egypt, but also Syria, Palestine, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. For centuries they had stood as guardians of the Islamic heartlands, yet by the early 16th century their power was waning. Selim struck swiftly. In 1516, at the Battle of Marj Dabik near Aleppo, the Ottoman army overwhelmed the Mamluks. A year later, at the Battle of Ridania near Cairo, the Mamluk Sultanate was utterly defeated. Egypt, the jewel of the medieval Islamic world, was now under Ottoman control. The consequences of Selim's conquests were immense. By defeating the Mamluks, Selim added Egypt, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula to the empire. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina acknowledged Ottoman authority, giving Selim and his successors the role of protectors of Islam's most sacred sites. The Ottoman sultans now carried not only temporal power, but also spiritual prestige as leaders of the Muslim world. The empire was no longer just a regional power. It was a global empire with dominion stretching from the Balkans to the Red Sea. Selim's reign was short, lasting only 8 years, but his impact was profound. He had expanded the empire more in a single decade than many rulers did in a lifetime. He had shifted the center of the Ottoman world, integrating the Middle East and North Africa into its dominion. His conquests enriched the empire with the wealth of the Nile, the trade routes of Syria, and the spiritual authority of the holy cities. When he died in 1520, his son inherited not just a kingdom, but a vast empire that spanned 3 continents. That son was Suleiman, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent. His reign would bring the Ottoman Empire to its very peak, in power, in culture, and in influence. The world would come to know him as a lawgiver, a conqueror, and a patron of the arts. The stage was now set for the empire's golden age. When Suleiman died in 1520, the empire he left to his son was vast and powerful. Yet few could have predicted that under his successor, Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire would reach heights greater than ever before. Known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and to his own people as Suleiman the Lawgiver, his reign would mark the pinnacle of Ottoman power, prestige, and cultural brilliance. Suleiman ascended the throne at the age of 26. From the very beginning, he demonstrated not only ambition, but also extraordinary skill as a leader. He combined the vision of a conqueror with the wisdom of a legislator and the taste of a patron of the arts. Over the course of nearly half a century, he expanded the empire's borders, established enduring legal systems, and oversaw a flourishing of architecture, literature, and science. His military campaigns defined the first half of his reign. In Europe, he launched a series of conquests that made the Ottomans the dominant power of the continent. His first great triumph came in 1521 with the capture of Belgrade, a strategic fortress long considered a bulwark of Christian Europe. The fall of Belgrade opened the way for further Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. A year later, in 1522, Suleiman turned his attention to the Knights of St. John on the island of Rhodes. After a long and brutal siege, the knights surrendered, and Rhodes fell to the Ottomans. This victory gave Suleiman control of the eastern Mediterranean and secured Ottoman dominance over crucial sea routes. The expulsion of the knights also demonstrated Suleiman's ability to neutralize one of Christendom's most famous military orders. But it was in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs that Suleiman achieved one of his most decisive victories. Facing the Kingdom of Hungary, Suleiman's disciplined army overwhelmed the Hungarian forces in a single day. The young Hungarian king, Louis II, was killed in the battle, and the independence of Hungary effectively ended. Much of Hungary came under Ottoman control, while the rest was divided between the Habsburgs and Ottoman vassals. This victory made the Ottomans the unrivaled power in Eastern Europe. Suleiman's ambitions then led him to the gates of Vienna in 1529. Though the siege ultimately failed due to poor weather and logistical difficulties, the mere fact that the Ottomans reached the Austrian capital sent shockwaves across Europe. For the first time, the heart of the Habsburg monarchy had been directly threatened. The image of the Ottoman Empire as an unstoppable force loomed large in the minds of Europeans. Suleiman was equally active in the Mediterranean. His navy, commanded by the legendary Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, challenged the supremacy of Spain and Venice. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman fleet dominated much of the Mediterranean Sea, extending its reach as far as North Africa. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa decisively defeated a combined Christian fleet, ensuring Ottoman naval dominance for decades to come. The empire's influence stretched across the seas, linking Istanbul with Algiers, Alexandria, and beyond. To the east, Suleiman also expanded Ottoman power. He fought repeated wars against the Safavid Empire, securing control over Mesopotamia, including the great city of Baghdad. These victories cemented Ottoman dominance over the trade routes and religious centers of the region, while also securing their role as protectors of Sunni Islam against the rival Shia Safavids. Yet Suleiman's greatness was not measured by conquest alone. He earned the title of lawgiver because of his sweeping reforms in administration, justice, and governance. He codified laws, blending Islamic principles with practical rules for taxation, land tenure, and criminal justice. His legal code brought consistency and stability to a vast empire of diverse peoples and faiths. For many subjects, Suleiman's reign represented fairness and order, a stark contrast to the chaos of fragmented rule they had known before. Culturally, Suleiman presided over a golden age. Istanbul became a center of art, architecture, and scholarship. The great architect Mimar Sinan, who served under Suleiman, designed some of the most breathtaking structures of the empire, including the Süleymaniye Mosque, which still dominates the skyline of Istanbul today. Poets, calligraphers, and scholars thrived under his patronage, blending Islamic, Persian, and Turkish traditions into a rich cultural tapestry. Even Suleiman himself was a poet, writing under the pen name Muhibi, leaving behind verses that revealed his personal thoughts and emotions. But his reign was not without personal trials. His relationship with his wife, Hürrem Sultan, also known as Roxelana, changed the nature of the Ottoman court. Breaking with tradition, Suleiman married her formally and elevated her to an unprecedented position of influence. Hürrem became deeply involved in politics, shaping decisions within the palace and setting the stage for the era later known as the Sultanate of Women. Their partnership, though controversial, symbolized the changing dynamics of power within the empire. Suleiman ruled for nearly 46 years, longer than any other Ottoman sultan. By the time of his death in 1566 during a campaign in Hungary, the empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. His reign marked the height of Ottoman political, military, and cultural power. To his subjects, he was the embodiment of justice and magnificence. To his enemies, he was the most formidable ruler of his age. The golden age of the Ottomans under Suleiman the Magnificent left a legacy that would echo for centuries. His empire stood at the crossroads of continents and civilizations, a beacon of strength and sophistication. But with greatness also came challenges. As the empire grew, so too did the complexities of ruling it. The years after Suleiman would test whether the Ottomans could maintain the heights they had reached, or whether decline would slowly set in. When Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, the empire was at its zenith. Its armies had reached the gates of Vienna, its fleets dominated the Mediterranean, and its scholars and architects had left a cultural legacy that dazzled the world. But with such heights came new challenges. How could the empire sustain this vast power? The reigns that followed marked the beginning of gradual change. Expansion slowed, administrative cracks widened, and powerful enemies began to push back. Suleiman's son, Selim II, inherited the throne. Unlike his father, Selim was not a warrior king. Nicknamed Selim the Sot by later historians due to his indulgent lifestyle, he preferred the comforts of the palace to the hardships of campaign. Yet under his reign, the empire still carried momentum from Suleiman's era. In 1571, however, the Ottomans faced one of their greatest naval setbacks at the Battle of Lepanto. A coalition of European powers, the Holy League, assembled their fleets and confronted the Ottomans in the Gulf of Patras. The result was a crushing defeat for the Ottoman navy. For the first time in more than a century, the myth of Ottoman invincibility was broken. Yet even this disaster did not stop the empire's ambition. Within a year, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet. They retained control of key ports and trade routes, reminding the world that, though wounded, the empire was far from finished. The next great test came on land. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Ottomans faced powerful new rivals: the rising Habsburg dynasty in Central Europe and the Safavids in Persia. Long wars drained Ottoman resources and tested the limits of their armies. Victories were still won, such as at the capture of Cyprus and later campaigns against Persia, but the days of sweeping, unstoppable conquests were giving way to slower, grinding wars of attrition. Inside the empire, new challenges emerged. The Ottoman system had long depended on the discipline of the Janissaries, the elite corps of soldiers recruited through the Devshirme system. Over time, however, the Janissaries grew powerful, wealthy, and resistant to reform. What had once been a disciplined military order became a political force, capable of deposing sultans and interfering in state affairs. This erosion of military discipline weakened the empire from within. The succession of sultans after Suleiman also highlighted a growing problem. Many rulers who followed were less capable, sheltered by the opulence of the palace. Instead of leading armies into battle, they often remained in Istanbul, leaving military campaigns to generals. The once dynamic leadership that had defined the early Ottomans gave way to a bureaucracy increasingly burdened by corruption, intrigue, and inefficiency. Still, the empire remained formidable. Its sheer size, wealth, and strategic location gave it resilience. The Ottomans controlled trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. They ruled over diverse peoples, from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary. Their capital, Istanbul, continued to shine as one of the world's greatest cities, a center of learning, art, and commerce. But history was changing. The 17th century brought new technologies, new economies, and new powers rising in Europe. The age of exploration had shifted global trade routes toward the Atlantic, reducing the importance of the overland Silk Road that had enriched the Ottomans. European empires like Spain, Portugal, and later the Dutch and English carved out colonies across the oceans, drawing wealth directly from the Americas and Asia. While the Ottomans still controlled immense territory, they were slowly losing their monopoly over global trade. One of the most dramatic moments of this era came in 1683, when the Ottomans launched their second great siege of Vienna. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led a massive army to the gates of the Habsburg capital. The city was on the brink of collapse, but at the last moment, a coalition of European forces led by the Polish King John III Sobieski arrived to lift the siege. The Ottoman army suffered a catastrophic defeat. The failed siege of Vienna marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. From this point on, the empire would shift from an advancing power to a defending one. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 confirmed this turning point. For the first time in its history, the empire ceded large territories in Europe, including Hungary and Transylvania. The Ottomans, once feared as the unstoppable force of Europe, were now on the defensive. And yet, even in decline, the empire remained one of the world's greatest powers. The 18th century would bring reform attempts, struggles to modernize, and renewed clashes with European rivals. The Ottomans were no longer rising, but neither were they collapsing. Instead, they entered a long and difficult chapter of adaptation and survival. The 18th century dawned with the Ottoman Empire, no longer the terrifying force that had once shaken Europe, but still a vast and influential state. Its armies were weaker, its territories threatened, yet its prestige remained. What followed was a period of survival and adaptation. The story of how an empire tried to reform itself in the face of modernity and rising European dominance. After the defeat at Vienna and the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans began a long phase of recalibration. They were still strong enough to defend themselves, but the balance of power had shifted. European states, Austria, Russia, and later Britain and France, became increasingly aggressive in exploiting Ottoman weaknesses. Wars with Russia became especially frequent as the Tsars sought to expand southward to reach warm water ports on the Black Sea. Despite defeats, the empire endured. In the early 18th century, the so-called Tulip era under Sultan Ahmed III, 1703-1730, symbolized a cultural revival. It was a time of art, gardens, music, and literature, as well as the introduction of the printing press in Ottoman lands. The tulip, a flower imported from Persia, became the symbol of elegance and refinement in Istanbul. But this era of leisure also revealed the widening gap between the wealthy elites and the struggling population. Resentment boiled over in 1730 with the Patrona Halil revolt, ending the tulip era and reminding the empire that luxury without reform would not secure its future. As the century progressed, the Ottomans found themselves fighting repeated wars with Russia and Austria. These wars exposed how far behind the empire had fallen in terms of military technology and organization. European armies had modernized with new tactics and disciplined standing forces, while the Ottoman system still relied heavily on outdated practices and the increasingly unruly janissaries. Every defeat cost the empire territory and prestige, from the northern shores of the Black Sea to the Balkans. By the late 18th century, the need for reform was undeniable. Sultan Selim III, 1789-1807, attempted sweeping changes, known as the Nizam-e-Jadid, or New Order. He sought to modernize the army, introduce Western-style training, and strengthen the state. But the Janissaries, who feared losing their power, resisted fiercely. In 1807, they revolted, deposed Selim, and executed many of his supporters. The cycle of attempted reform and violent resistance would haunt the empire for the next century. The 19th century brought even greater challenges. Europe was entering the Industrial Revolution, creating powerful economies and advanced armies, while the Ottomans struggled to keep up. Nationalism, a new political force sweeping the world, began to tear at the fabric of the empire. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and others, inspired by European ideas and supported by foreign powers, rose in rebellion. The Greek War of Independence, 1821-1830, was a particularly devastating blow. For the first time, a Christian nation within the empire successfully broke free, aided by Britain, France, and Russia. The once mighty empire was shrinking before the eyes of the world. Reform, however, was not abandoned. The Tanzimat era, beginning in 1839, marked the most ambitious effort to modernize Ottoman society. New laws promised equality for all subjects, regardless of religion. The empire attempted to modernize its army, economy, and administration, inspired by European models. Railways were built, schools were opened, and bureaucracies expanded. Yet progress was uneven. Conservative elements resisted change, corruption slowed implementation, and European powers interfered constantly, often more interested in exploiting Ottoman weakness than in supporting reform. Meanwhile, one of the empire's most important provinces, Egypt, slipped away. Under the ambitious governor Muhammad Ali Pasha, Egypt built its own modern army and effectively ruled independently by the early 19th century. Though still nominally Ottoman, Egypt charted its own course, demonstrating how fragile central authority had become. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, showed both the empire's weakness and its continued geopolitical importance. The Ottomans, backed by Britain and France, fought against Russia and managed to hold their ground. Yet the war was won largely thanks to European support, not Ottoman strength. The empire had become the sick man of Europe, a term that would be repeated throughout the century. Nationalist uprisings only intensified. The Balkans, once the heart of Ottoman Europe, became a battlefield of independence movements. Serbia gained autonomy, Romania emerged, and Bulgaria rose in revolt. Each loss chipped away not just at territory, but at the empire's identity as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. By the late 19th century, the empire was a shadow of its former self. Reform movements like those of the Young Ottomans and later the Young Turks pushed for constitutional government, modernization, and revival. But these efforts clashed with conservative forces and the entrenched interests of the military and bureaucracy. The empire still endured, stretching from Anatolia to parts of the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its capital, Istanbul, remained a great city, rich with culture and history. Yet the world around it had changed dramatically. New empires, British, French, Russian, carved up the globe, and the Ottomans increasingly found themselves the object of foreign manipulation, a pawn in the great game of European politics. The stage was now set for the empire's final century. The 20th century would bring revolution, war, and ultimately the end of the dynasty that had ruled for more than 600 years. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was still vast on a map, but fragile in reality. Once feared as the unstoppable conqueror of Europe, Asia, and Africa, it was now struggling to hold itself together. The world called it the sick man of Europe. And though the name was cruel, it captured a painful truth. The empire that had once risen with fire and steel was now facing its twilight. The 19th century had already taken its toll. Nationalist revolts had stripped away much of the empire's Balkan territories. Greece had broken free. Serbia had become autonomous, and Bulgaria and Romania were no longer under Ottoman rule. European powers constantly intervened, each eager to gain influence over Ottoman lands. Britain and France eyed the Middle East, while Russia pressed from the north. The empire's sovereignty was being chipped away piece by piece. Still, the Ottomans did not give up. Reform movements continued. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution and parliament, sparking hopes of a revived modern empire. But internal divisions remained deep. Ethnic tensions, competing visions of reform, and the growing influence of military officers created instability. The empire's fate accelerated during the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913. In a series of rapid defeats, the Ottomans lost almost all of their European territories, including Macedonia and Albania. What remained of the empire was now largely confined to Anatolia, the Middle East, and a few enclaves. The centuries-old dream of Ottoman dominance in Europe was finally over. Then came the greatest test of all, World War I. The empire joined the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, in 1914, hoping that an alliance would secure its survival. Instead, the war pushed the Ottomans into catastrophe. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 became a moment of both pride and tragedy. Allied forces, led by Britain and France, attempted to seize the Dardanelles and capture Istanbul. Ottoman troops, under the leadership of commanders like Mustafa Kemal, fought fiercely and successfully defended their homeland. Gallipoli was a rare victory, remembered as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds. But elsewhere the empire crumbled. In the Middle East, Arab revolts erupted, encouraged and armed by Britain. The famous campaign of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, saw Arab forces rise against Ottoman rule, capturing cities and severing supply lines. British armies advanced from Egypt into Palestine, capturing Jerusalem in 1917. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, British troops seized Baghdad. One by one, Ottoman provinces in the Arab world slipped away. Meanwhile, on the home front, the empire endured immense suffering. Economic collapse, famine, and internal displacement scarred the population. The war exhausted the Ottoman state to its core. In 1918, as Germany and Austria collapsed, the Ottomans too were forced to surrender. The Armistice of Mudros ended the fighting, but it marked the beginning of occupation. Allied powers divided Ottoman lands. Britain took Palestine and Iraq, France took Syria and Lebanon, and Greece occupied parts of Anatolia. The capital, Istanbul itself, fell under Allied control. The empire of the sultans seemed finished. But out of this darkness came a new force. In Anatolia, resistance formed under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. Rejecting both foreign occupation and the old imperial order, he organized a nationalist movement. The Turkish War of Independence, 1919-1923, was fought against invading Greek, British, French, and Italian forces. Against all odds, the Turkish nationalists prevailed. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul on a British warship, ending more than 600 years of Ottoman rule. In its place, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in 1923, with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as its first president. Thus ended the story of the Ottoman Empire, a dynasty that had begun with Osman and his small band of warriors in the 13th century, risen to dominate 3 continents, and endured for more than 6 centuries. It had brought great achievements, architectural wonders like the Hagia Sophia's transformation, the Suleimaniye Mosque, and the Blue Mosque, cultural legacies of poetry, calligraphy, and law, and a lasting influence on the politics, religion, and identity of vast regions. Its decline was long, painful, and complex, shaped by both internal struggles and the unstoppable rise of European powers. Yet its legacy lives on. The Ottoman Empire was not just a chapter in history, it was a bridge between East and West, between the medieval and the modern world. And though its empire is gone, the echoes of its rise and fall still shape the Middle East, the Balkans, and Turkey today.